Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. My name is Michael Harrison, a proud member of the class of 2001. As president of the Duke Alumni Association Board of Directors, I would like to welcome you to today's program, What It Means to Be an American. During these challenging times, many are reflecting on this exact question. Those of us who are Americans, and even those around the world, including friends and allies, competitors and adversaries, what does it mean to be an American? The answers are personal, endless, and varied. Tonight, we welcome a panel, and tonight we welcome Duke faculty and alumni speakers to share their perspectives, experiences, and insights. I'd like to extend a Blue Devil thank you to everyone who submitted questions in advance for tonight's program. Some of them have shaped this discussion or have been queued up for Q&A at the end. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our distinguished moderator, David M. Rubenstein. David graduated magna cum laude from Duke in 1970, earned his JD from the University of Chicago Law School, where he was editor of the Law Review and is founder and co-executive chairman of the Carlyle Group. He served as chairman of the Duke University Board of Trustees from 2013 to 2017 and is a Duke parent. His son Andrew graduated in 2015. David has been a devoted supporter to Duke, donating his time, treasure, and talent on numerous occasions. Away from Duke, he has generously contributed to the preservation of many of the United States' most famous documents and historical monuments, saying he sees these patriotic philanthropy, he sees this patriotic philanthropy as a down payment for his obligation to repay the country for everything that he's had. And he stresses that he believes a more informed and educated citizenry will lead to a stronger democracy. Well known for his peer-to-peer conversations on the David Rubenstein Show on PBS, we are thrilled to have David moderating tonight's discussion. Please join me in welcoming David.
Michael, thank you very much for those. See, is it working now? Let's see. There. Okay, Michael, thank you very much for those kind, overly generous remarks. And I want to welcome everybody to this Duke event, this Duke alumni event. When Douglas MacArthur retired as five-star general, he said to the Congress of the United States that old generals don't die, they just fade away. Well, some of you may wonder what happens to old board chairs. Well, they neither die nor fade away. They get involved in Duke alumni events. And so I'm proud to be involved in Duke alumni events and proud to be asked to be the moderator tonight. Think about this. I doubt that there are many countries where this kind of conversation could be had. In Germany, people are probably not saying, what does it mean to be a German? In France, people are not probably saying or having seminars on what does it mean to be French. In Saudi Arabia, people are probably not saying, what does it mean to be Saudi? But in America, we have been debating this issue for several hundred years. And that's in part because we are a country of immigrants. We are a country where for a long time, we didn't want certain people who lived here to be Americans. For example, when the country was started, we had about 500,000 African Americans who were slaves. We also had Native Americans who were not welcome into the country. And we've struggled over the years to give people their rights and to make certain that they feel like they are an American. Even today, we don't know exactly what it means to be an American. Everyone has their own views. We haven't given everybody all the rights they think they should get or all the things they're entitled to as Americans, but we certainly made a lot of progress. And tonight, what we'd like to do is have a very frank conversation from three people who have very different backgrounds, some native born, some not native born, about what it means to be an American. And I think you'll find this conversation, I hope, very, very interesting and illuminating. So let me introduce the people that we're going to have on this panel. First, Eileen Chow. Eileen, welcome to the panel. Eileen is a visiting associate professor of Chinese and Japanese cultural studies at Duke. She is a native of Taiwan, and she now is also the director of an institute of Chinese journalism at Shin University in Taiwan. But she got her graduate and undergraduate education in the United States, undergraduate education at Harvard, and her PhD in comparative literature at Stanford. And now she's involved at Duke in number of activities, but she is, among other things, the founding co-director of the Story Lab at Duke. Eileen, thank you very much for joining the panel.
Thank you, David.
Next is Tommy Sowers. Tommy is an graduate of Duke, graduated in class of 98. He is now an adjunct assistant professor in Duke Innovation and Entrepreneurship program, but he has a very eclectic background. He is a professor teaching here now. He is also taught at West Point. He also has a military background. He served 11 years in the U.S. military and did 2 tours of duty in Iraq and served there as a Green Beret. He's also an entrepreneur, having started many companies, and now is teaching many people at Duke how to start companies, particularly those that might help some benefit to the U.S. military. And so in many ways, he's a unique individual with a very eclectic background, and he's also a scholar. He has a PhD from the London School of Economics. So Tommy, welcome to our panel.
Thank you, David.
And Hardy Vieux is also a Duke graduate. He graduated in 1993. He was president of the student body. He was president of the Duke Alumni Association. He's also served with me on the board of trustees, and he is also a practicing lawyer. After graduating from Duke, he ultimately got his degree from the University of Michigan Law School and a master's in public policy at the University of Michigan as well. Hardy is somebody who's now spending a lot of time in the nonprofit area. He manages human rights first refugee representation work. He has served as a private lawyer in the private sector, but has spent most of his lawyering in the nonprofit sector and now is very involved in refugee litigation. Hardy, welcome to our panel.
Thank you, David.
So thank you all for joining, and hopefully we'll resolve the question of what it means to be an American. And after this panel discussion, everybody will know what it means to be an American. So let me start off with Eileen. So Eileen, you are an ethnic Chinese born in Taiwan. And explain to me whether, if you're an ethnic Chinese, do you feel that you're more your greater loyalty or greater identification is to be Chinese, or is it to be a Taiwanese, or let's say if you were a member of you were a resident in China. So in other words, I'm trying to figure out whether as an ethnic Chinese, how do you identify yourself as Chinese, Taiwanese, or it doesn't make a difference?
Thank you, David, for moderating this panel, and you just gave me the hardest question ever. That will probably have me end up in trouble in some way. But I did grow up in Taiwan. My family went to Taiwan from China, various parts of China, in the 1950s. So my ethnic identification, my national identification, my cultural identification, and also my experience of immigrating to the US for higher ed at age 16 are all melded together in how I define myself. But I wondered if I could pivot a little bit to talking about the Sinatra song that you began with.
Okay.
Because The House I Live In, what a lovely song. But, and it was recorded during World War II as a song for military, and written by Earl Robinson, and who was later blacklisted during the MacArthur era. And the song was recorded by a host of people, Josh White from the Harlem Renaissance to, Sarah Vaughan, Anita Bryan, Patti LaBelle, but of course, most famously by Sinatra. And the reason I wanted to talk about the song is I think that is a way of getting back to your initial question, which is, what does it mean to be American? I think basically it's always a moving target. Who belongs in the house that is called America, and the ways in which people who might be comfortably in the house might be excluded, or people who were excluded might be who might find themselves in the house. And so Sinatra, of course, made the song a hit, but Paul Robeson also recorded this. And the song itself was a kind of part of the Yiddish Revue, and written by Lewis Allen, of Strange Fruit fame, and of course adopted the Rosenberg orphans. So I feel like that to me is kind of the history of not that people feel more or less belonging or more or less American, but rather that at any given moment, the context and the furniture and the decor and the location of the house keep on changing. And so that's part of how I think about being American. So ethnically Chinese is part of my heritage, but being American is part of my future.
Okay, so let me see if I can help you get your visa revoked with another question. Your visa to go back to Taiwan.
Right.
So do you feel that people you have met who are Americans take greater pride in being an American than people who are Chinese take pride in being either Taiwanese or a member of China, or just ethnically Chinese? Do you see a greater difference, a real difference in the pride that they take, or no real difference?
Well, you know, weirdly enough, I've always thought for Han ethnicity Chinese in PRC China, that it's actually strangely similar to Americans in the sense that pride is indeed central. Pride in a kind of old English sense actually means superiority. And it's only now that we think of pride as in, say, LGBT pride or what in taking part in equality. But pride usually meant above everybody else. And the Middle Kingdom was literally thought of itself as the center of the universe. Etymologically speaking, all the tribes that surrounded the Middle Kingdom were characterized with characters, with Chinese characters that had animal or weapon radicals. So they were seen as lesser than human. And so part of Chinese identity has always been this innate sense of superiority. But it puts people who are not of the majority ethnicity in a really strange place, including people in Taiwan, or people who want to declare independence, people who think of themselves as parts of other communities and other ethnicities and nationalities. In the US, I think this is kind of a similar process, right? That you have a group of people that, think of themselves as really the center of the universe, and that to be challenged on that is also a creation of resentment. So the white supremacy movement in the US is, to me, and I probably will be banned everywhere, but strangely similar to a kind of very Han-centric Chineseness. But as someone who has always been in the margins of Chineseness, both growing up in Taiwan and also part of the Chinese American and Chinese diaspora community in other parts of the world, including here, I think it makes it easy for me to see the ways you can separate national pride and cultural pride.
So let me ask you, as a naturalized American, do you feel any less of an American than your friends who are native-born Americans? You somehow feel you're second class by being naturalized? You feel there's no real difference and people treat you no differently?
Well, I feel that one of the postulates of identity that I always talk to my students about is who you think you are versus what other people think you are. And also, the story you tell is the story that you are, right? And I think immigrants are more American than a lot of Americans who think of themselves as native born, only in the sense that immigrants model a right to have rights. And I don't mean superior immigrants. I don't mean people who found Google and, win Pulitzer Prizes, but I mean immigrants by nature of arriving and challenging the Constitution and its promises to say democracy is about living in the land in which everyone is an alien, because we all have to relate to each other as strangers under the law. So I feel like immigrants just make that even more vivid. And so in that sense, I feel more American than ever. Now, however, how other people see me is a whole nother story, right? So,
well, let me ask a final question before we go into Tommy. Not quite about being an American, but sort of. Obviously, there's been a lot of discrimination against some people in the United States. People from China were not allowed to immigrate into this country for long periods of his country's history. So do you feel that now, as a well-educated person who is a naturalized American citizen, but ethnically looking Chinese, that there is discrimination against you? Do you feel it regularly, or you feel there's no discrimination? If you were a white Caucasian, you'd feel the same way as you do as an ethnic Chinese?
I feel undoubtedly there's discrimination, but my class prevents me, right? So, I mean, I feel that in the US, you can never talk about race and ethnicity separate from class and gender. And in that sense, by being a Duke professor, I have a certain protection where I live, where I do my shopping, et cetera. But even in 2020, with all the talk of China virus, obviously it's been a huge rise in anti-Asian racism in the US and also globally. And so that kind of xenophobia is always on the surface. And so even when I don't personally feel it, I understand collectively that it's a threat. And it's happened on Duke campus, right? So many times, even over the past decade.
Okay, Tommy, you've taught at West Point and now you teach at Duke. Now, the presumption of an average citizen would be that the people at a military academy are more, talking about their patriotism. They're prepared to die for their country in many ways. Do you feel that when you met with West Point students and you meet with Duke students, they feel differently towards the countries, one more patriotic than the other, one more American than the other, or not really?
Well, first off, thank you, David, Eileen, and Harvey for joining on this, and the Duke alumni for setting up, such a great panel, and especially the audience for joining us tonight. Really, it was just it's an honor to teach both these different sets of students, and there's far more similarities than differences. At Duke, I teach a course that is actually open up to the entire school. So I've taught med, MBA, law, undergrads, master's students, PhDs, and then I taught undergrads at both schools as well. Yeah, and sure, there's no saluting at Duke when I stand up in class, and not everyone is headed into the Army like they were at West Point. But a commonality that I've seen is just this real desire for purpose at this inflection point that is education. There's kind of two examples of this that I could bring to light. So when I first taught at Duke, I just came out of the previous administration and I taught a course on leadership. Katie Colas was one of my students, Duke soccer star, super driven, just came off of a banking internship that she wasn't really feeling. And in my class, we spent a lot of time with political actors and why they get into the political sphere, what they do. And that really was an inflection point for her. She ended up joining the FBI, did great, and was named to the National Security Council and spent a good chunk of the last couple of years briefing and traveling with the president. And, she's young and driven, and she's got a real sense of purpose. And then another student I taught was a cadet at West Point, Chris Greist. And her passion was, why do we have a military that many women can't access all parts of it? And I served a big chunk of my time in the all male military, in the special forces. And she was driven by changing this. And in the class, we encourage people to find out why policies are the way they are, and find out which actors made these decisions and interview them and figure out how you can make a difference on this. She wrote a great paper, and more importantly, 6 years later, she ended up becoming the first female Ranger School graduate. And, there's a commonality between these super smart students. I mean, one, thank God I went to Duke back in '98. There's no way I could get in now. But they're driven by this I'm sense of purpose and meaning and trying to make an impact. And they're opening up opportunities for my little girls in the way that, I'm proud of them. And it's such an honor to teach.
Okay, well, let me ask you this. When you're in Iraq and you're prepared to give what Lincoln called the last full measure of devotion to your country, do you feel, and do other soldiers feel, that they are more American because they're prepared to sacrifice their life than those who are sitting back in the United States, not engaged in the same type of combat? Is there a difference?
Well, I mean, it's surely something that you think about, because you're wearing a flag on your shoulder, you're overseas, you've sworn to support and defend the Constitution. I never really had that feeling of being more American. There was 1 minute, though, that I remember. In my first tour in Iraq, I was a Green Beret team leader. It was a really rough time in Iraq, and I had a price on my head the whole time, 8 months. And while I was in Iraq, I got a Dear John letter from my first fiance. She was a New York attorney, and I knew when I got out of Iraq, I needed to get to New York and patch things up as quickly as possible. So most Green Berets, when you transition out, it's not like the rest of the Army where you take 2 weeks. It's more of like a high five with the next team, and then boom, like 24 hours later, you're back in America. So I went from Iraqi house with a price on my head to like walking around the streets of Manhattan in 2004. And, I was struck by, look, nobody cares. Like everyone's going about their business or rushing around, they're making money, they're living their lives. No one really cares about the sacrifice that I made. I had this like one selfish minute, but it really passed. Like I remembered, like I volunteered for this. I volunteered for this a number of times. And if my service makes it easier for people to live their lives largely uninterrupted, to do what they want to do in life, then that's really like all the thanks I need. And today, I mean, I get that now. There are frontline workers, there are scientists, there are researchers, there are doctors who are taking on this current challenge, and I get to live my life largely uninterrupted. So I do want to say that, you know, soldiers and vets, you know, they're not perfect. Like they're America. They're, you know, they're good and bad. They're your neighbors. And, you know, the vast majority of them, you know, you think vets all are conducting raids and on point on, you know, terrorist raids and all that, but, you know, a lot of them aren't. And I get really wary of vets saying, speaking for veterans, or as a veteran, I say this, you know, they served, it's honorable service, but we're not entitled to a greater claim of being American than, and it's dangerous when we do.
So don't leave this story unfulfilled. What happened when you went back to see the person who sent the Dear John letter to you?
Oh, well, no, that I got engaged 4 times, but the last one stuck, and I'm happily married. And so
okay.
she made me a better person. So,
okay. So when you now teach at Duke, you teach students who are Native Americans or born in America, and you teach some who are immigrants. So I think maybe not immigrants, but they're foreign citizens who are at Duke as undergraduates. And I think maybe 10 to 12% of our undergraduates are probably from international countries. Do you feel that those who are native to the United States feel a greater pride in their country, our country, than those who are from overseas do in their country? You see any distinction or not really?
I can't really, I wouldn't say that. I mean, I teach a class called Mission Driven Startups, and we mash together basically the entire university onto 4-person interdisciplinary teams to solve U.S. military national security, usually technical problems. And we teach them how to build a startup in order to do that. And about a quarter of the students that we've had are foreign nationals. We've had, you know, Chinese, Austrian, Egyptian, a whole variety of folks. And I think it's just this common thing of they get to work on a real world problem. They get to solve it with an entirely, you know, different set of folks. They get sort of reintroduced to the incredible diversity at Duke. So I haven't seen a greater patriotism. I like all the students that come into the course really kind of dig into the mission and put a lot of time and effort into it. So.
Okay. So when you're in Iraq, did you ever think to yourself as a special forces person, maybe you should have gone to law school or medical school? Did your parents ever say, hey, maybe you shouldn't be doing that, or you never had that feeling?
Oh, sure. I had that feeling. I mean, there were some really like bad days there. But, you know, it was, I didn't necessarily agree with all the, you know, the premises of this, but, you know, a lot of that is what you hear about. I mean, I was responsible for 12 men and about 500 Iraqis who were working with us and responsible for their lives. So, you know, one thing that you get in the military, and I got this, you know, as young platoon leader in the Balkans, is you get an incredible amount of responsibility and leadership opportunity at an incredibly young age. So those experiences have formed me and allowed me to be a better CEO, be a better, you know, member of the administration. I have gratitude for those, but it's not that every day was a good day. And there were plenty of days where it's like, I'd like to not be here right now.
Okay. Hardy, is it your observation that Black Americans' pride in being American is roughly the same as white Americans? So you, obviously you're not a white American, so you can't completely answer that question by first person analysis, but in your observation, do Black Americans have a different sense of pride in being American or feel different about being American than whites feel about being American?
Thank you, David, for that question and for having us here today. The song "I'm Black and I'm Proud" just came to mind. It's certainly different. I don't pretend to try to speak for all of Black America, but I'll say that pride and value, I think, are really different in my mind. Like, I could see the value of being American every day, all day, right? Like, whether it's the right to free speech, the right to assembly, that to me is a consistent, discernible thread. Whereas my pride in being American, it depends on which day you catch me, right? That's if you caught me in May and June, it was probably waning quite a bit. And then on some other instances, when I'm on the National Mall and something big is happening in our country, it might be waxing. So I try to parse the two out. But I think for Black Americans, it's complicated. It is, to get to our pride, it feels like it's a uphill slog, David. You got to go through a whole lot of stuff to get to the pride. It's non-linear, it's soul crushing, it's exhausting to be a Black American. But at the end of the day, we nonetheless get there. Like, we travel that slog, and we get there, and we get there in a way that we understand that this America is just as much ours as it is Tommy's or Eileen's. So it is in no way that we have sort of less pride. It's just we've got to go through it. And I think we when I talk about that slog, it's because of going back to 1619 and the White Lion ship arriving at Point Comfort, Virginia. I mean, that's where it starts. And so for the last 401 years, the tale is a complicated one. There's indentured servitude, there's slavery, there's Dred Scott case where the court declares that a Black man is not actually a citizen of the United States. There's Jim Crow, there's segregation, there is structural racism. There's, as a former military member as well, there's a segregation of the armed forces until 1948. And then you make your way to police brutality and how COVID disproportionately impacts Black Americans. So that entire tale is a very, very, very complex one, which I think at the end of the day makes me feel like in order to be a Black person in America, you are by definition a really hopeful person.
Okay, I should have mentioned in your introduction, you were a member of the Navy JAG Corps for a number of years as well. So let me ask you another easy question. So do you think that while our country now encourages, I would say, immigration from people that have certain skills and talents and so forth, that there is still a prejudice against Black immigrants as opposed to white immigrants?
Yes. I see it in the policies of the day that there's so many times I find myself pushing back against an immigration policy. And as a Black American, as a Haitian American, I often am focused on the legal argument, but at the end of the day, I go, this is just good old straight up racism. It's the sort of racism that we saw with like Chinese exclusion laws, the sort of racism that you saw with Korematsu. So I always sort of rail a little bit when someone says, well, this is not our America. And I'm like, actually, I think this is our America. That's not to say I'm not proud to be an American, but let's just get our facts right, that a lot of things that we see today are unfortunately indicative of America throughout several hundred years and dating back to the Declaration of Independence itself. So I believe and see it every day that there is significant racism by way of structural efforts to marginalize Black and brown people, and particularly migrants, and that makes their opportunities in America that much more difficult to attain.
Okay, let me ask another question, which may get you in trouble as well, which is, do you think that if you're a native-born African-American, you live in this country, and let's say your ancestors have been here for 400 years, are you as interested in having immigrants from the Caribbean who are Black coming into the country, or do you feel that native-born African-Americans actually are not any more encouraging of Haitians coming in or equivalent than whites are? Or do they say we want to have more people that have African blood in them? How do you look at that?
I think it depends on the story you're telling and your receptiveness to that story. So what I mean by story is, I go back to the Emma Lazarus poem at the base of the Statue of Liberty. Give me your huddled masses, and I think about those huddle masters. And I think if your vision of America is one of prosperity and you see yourself as a person that's prospering, you're going to receive that tale very differently. So I think if you look at America as America in mourning, as in MOR and NING, right? Like the Ronald Reagan, like, you know, morning comes, you might receive this story in a much more hopeful, positive way, to the point that you go, why not share the large S? But if you look at as America as in mourning, as in MOURNING, I think then you receive the story in a way that says, you're going to take my job, you're a threat to me, and all I see is that somehow you're going to make my life more difficult. You're going to encroach on my suburbs, you're going to bring crime to my doorstep, you're going to make my students' learning experience in school that much more challenging. So I think it's a narrative that shifts depending on time, place, and socioeconomic context. And so that's why the power of storytelling is really important. And I think we see that.
And final question to you right now, and because I've asked you many times before, you're a well-trained lawyer. You could be working at a very famous law firm somewhere making lots of money. Why are you working in a nonprofit area to help refugees get into the United States? What has compelled you to do that?
I think my mother planted that question with you, but I think the compelling piece of this for me, David, is I tried the private sector and I did it because I had to be an adult to pay bills. But I'm reminded of something a friend of mine once said, is that life is once. And I think I woke up one morning and that statement hit me, that what I was doing, I didn't find it fulfilling. And so, and it happened in a building. I was in Haiti right after the earthquake, and I was sleeping on top of a building that had its share of damages. And I remember I'm waking up with my BlackBerry back then and having reception and texting a lawyer I was working on a case with, and that person being really upset with some document that I allegedly withheld. And I remember thinking, I don't know that I care. I should care, but I don't know that I care. And so it dawned on me that if my life is once, then I ought to be taking some different steps to make that happen. And so that's very much why I do that work. It's a matter of trying to fight for justice. And because my personal journey, my personal story is very much anchored in the immigrant one. So it's probably my way of paying back.
Okay. Eileen, can you tell us how you try to help people or students from China assimilate into the American culture when you're teaching them? And how has the Duke Kunshan University affected the way people in China look at Duke and the way you look at Duke?
David, 谢谢你. Well, one of the things is to challenge assumptions that we, for example, speak English in America. In January 2019, a professor at Duke got into a lot of trouble for sending a mass email to all the graduate students in biostatistics, asking them not to speak Chinese to each other in public spaces because it was making other students feel excluded and uncomfortable. But as you know, the US doesn't have an English language as a national language. And so part of what I try to do with my students is to teach about this idea of restoring kind of fullness to American history. I know you're a big fan of US history. And I think that, you know, like the 1619 Project, or like when I teach the Chinese Exclusion Act, it's not about searching for gotcha moments for grievance, but rather saying all Americans should be educated better and know more about the history that forms us in this particular moment. And I really love what Hardy just said about for people who are not presumed to be the center of a kind of mainstream American culture, but still take great pride and value in being American. I think it's really important to think about radical hope. Like, this is Professor Jonathan Lear's term, but to imagine being hopeful for things that don't yet exist. And I think that's what in my teaching, you know, with my Chinese students, be they Chinese American, Asian American, fifth generation. One of my students from 2 years ago was a sixth generation Asian American whose family has always served in the military. And, but everybody still thinks of her as a foreigner, even though she doesn't even speak Chinese. And, but then also these international students who are here for a semester, a year, for 4 years. And so how do you say, both of you have space in this big house, and the house is constantly expanding. I mentioned the Sinatra song about how house we live in, but he leaves out the line, "The house I live in, my neighbor's white and black," and that really angered the original songwriters. And so when Paul Robeson re-recorded it, he added that phrase, right? So I think for Chinese Americans and Chinese international students, it's a question of how do you belong to this narrative that might be a little bit pre-written for you or written by others, but can you still add in? Kunshan has been amazing. Kunshan, I think I was part of the skeptical crew that didn't know how one could start a liberal arts education with uniquely American, perhaps, characteristics like freedom of speech and freedom of protest within, the U.S., within a Chinese higher educational space. But I've spoken there many times. Because of COVID, there are also Duke Kunshan students who are studying currently here in the US, and they're amazing. And I just feel like it shows the point that the more you learn, the better you are equipped to create hopeful narratives.
So if someone who looked like me moved to Taiwan and I wanted to be a citizen, you think there'd be more and let's suppose I learned how to speak Chinese, you think there'd be more discrimination against me there than Chinese coming here would have discrimination? How would you compare the two?
Could I be perfectly honest and say it would be very different for you and Tommy as opposed to Hardy? So I feel that that's something that we think about when we talk about American and also talk about xenophobia. Just like I think it is easier for me moving here than perhaps brown and black folk who are migrating. So this is something that is always a little bit dependent on context and also on capital, right? But I'm still in the romance of being a new American. As I mentioned to you all earlier, I was poll watching at the Carlyle Alumni Center all day today, and I met a 97-year-old lady named Betty who came to vote. And I'm still overwhelmed with love for that kind of moment in America. And so that's where I think, that's where I find it truly valuable to be American.
For those who may not be familiar with the process of becoming American, now you basically have to live here for 5 years and, among other things, take a citizenship test. There are 100 potential questions. You have to pass 6 out of 10. You're asked 10, you get 6. You have to get right. If you're over the age of 65, they tell you in advance what the 10 questions are going to be. 91% of the people who take this test pass, 91%. The same test was given to native-born Americans 2 years ago, 27,000 native-born Americans in all 50 states. And in 49 out of the 50 states, a majority of citizens failed that test. Only in Vermont did a bare majority pass. The point being that foreign immigrants often know more about our country's history and government than native-born. Tommy, can you explain to us what you're doing with Duke students now? You're trying to teach them how to be entrepreneurs. What is your specific goal that you're trying to get these students to do?
Well, David, my day job is I'm the lead for innovation for the Department of Defense for the Southeast. And yes, I'm trying to teach them to be entrepreneurs, but I'm sneakily trying to get them to serve their country. And on the first day of class, you go over the syllabus and I write idiots really big on the board. And these are really smart students. And eventually somebody asked me why I wrote that. And I tell them, the origin of this word is Greek. And it refers to idiote, which were private citizens who were not involved in public affairs. And then there's another class, citizens who were involved. And, we want more citizens and less idiots. So in my class, I've got 2 great co-instructors. One is an Twitter executive. One is a ex 4-star admiral. And we challenge these students to serve their country doing what they do best, not to put on the uniform and go shoot a gun or anything like that, but to build products and build technology. The students get out of the classroom. We have an abundance of military right in North Carolina. One of them actually flew an F-15. They train with special forces operators, and they're trying to get an understanding of the real problem that these operators or pilots have and build technology, usually websites or apps or data dashboards to solve them. Alumni can participate too, by the way. We had a 1973 grad who had never served their country, was appealing to this. So there is an opportunity for them to make money. The last class we had 5 teams. 3 of them have formed companies. One just won one of the top Air Force awards and is close to getting a $750,000 non-dilutive grant. So it's kind of sneaking in service wrapped around startups. And the one thing I'll say is this is happening really across Duke. I've been really impressed with Pratt and I&E. You've got a design health program that is building better processes for the Womack Army Hospital. You've got a Data Plus program that's doing predictive maintenance for F-15s. You've got a mechanical engineering capstone that's building a camera to sit on top of dogs for the 75th Ranger Regiment. And, you know, it's an opportunity. I believe that, you know, the next model of service is not full-time. You've got to enlist. You've got to move to Washington, D.C. But it's imperative to tap into the talent that is not just in the Duke community, but beyond. So that's, we wrap that in a course, and I love teaching it.
Hardy, why are some of the people you're representing, why do they want to come to America? Why are they really so desperate to come here? And when they get here, are they actually happy they're here and they stay here, or they wish they could go back to where they came from?
Well, I represent people seeking asylum, David. So there's a push-pull. The push forces them out of their country, that their lives have been put at risk at home. So they're willing to, they have to leave their countries because of some persecution. And so they're willing to risk everything to get a new start at life. And they're pulled toward the US, I think, for many of the reasons that probably the founding fathers and mothers of our country were. It's because there's an opportunity, belief of freedom, right? That you could pursue happiness. And so a lot of my clients, that's why they end up coming here when they're forced to abandon their homes. And when they get here, if they're happy, I think the vast majority are yes. That's not to minimize the challenges that they have to acclimating into a new country and the persecution that they have to face in this country. But it probably still is better than what they left back home because they were facing the barrel of a gun, or somebody was subjecting them to endless domestic violence, and there was no way for them to get protection. And so life here is ostensibly better for them. And the hope is that they could then build a new life, get asylum here, make their way towards citizenship, reunite with their loved ones, and make their way out of the margins, out of the shadows, into the middle, if you will.
Okay, well, while you have the floor, I'll ask each of you to answer this question. What does it mean to be an American to you?
I think for me, it's resilience and opportunity. Resilience because being a Black person in America is exhausting. So there are just some days I had a performance review recently, and I was thinking, can I just put that I woke up every day since March? Isn't that shouldn't that get me 5 out of 5? That's pretty awesome. And then I think in terms of opportunity, it's the belief that you can make something of yourself that wasn't originally there. And in my case, I have parents who immigrated from Haiti, neither of whom came to America knowing English, and neither of whom ever finished high school. And so my ability to make it to Duke and get out of there, it was close, is for me a symbol of the opportunity that this country presents.
Okay. For those who may not be familiar with the situation, we admit as citizens in this country, roughly 800,000 new citizens a year. No other country in the world comes close to admitting that many new citizens from overseas a year. Eileen, what does it mean to be an American to you?
Langston Hughes in 1935 said it best. He says, "America never was America to me, and yet I swear this oath, America will be." To me, America is a work in progress. America is an aspiration. Something that's been kind of heartbreaking for me in the last several years is that's a little bit of a laughingstock currently. And I think America is not just an aspiration for Americans. America is an aspiration for immigrants who want to come here and make a life. This is has always been a great pull factor. It's not just about making money here. It's about, all these other things that, America symbolizes. And I do hope that, like Langston Hughes, that we kind of contain that hope of thinking it hasn't happened yet, but it might still happen. I don't think any other country kind of sits around thinking it might still happen in the same way that Americans do about America. And that's really lovely.
Hey, Tommy, what does it mean to be an American to you?
Well, I reread some de Tocqueville in prep for this, and he observed two things. And, one is equality relative to other countries that are out there. And obviously, he was writing in 1831, and that was a small segment. But the other thing he observed was just this active participation. We have all these different levels of government, city, county, state, federal. And he noticed that like everybody was on the move, participating and being involved. To me, that's a real defining characteristic of America, is that you can be involved in the issues of your time. And I think of all the people that have lived in all the countries around the world over history, under despotism, during war, during conflict. And it isn't perfect today in America by far, but there is an opportunity. I'm in the 0.01% like affect the issues of my time. It's a real gift that you have as an American, and it's a question of what we do with it.
All right. So more important than even that question, what does it mean to be an American? What does it mean to be, Tommy, a Dookie?
Oh, I think when I was my senior year, I did this leadership in the arts program, this ridiculous, amazing Duke program up in New York, where you see all these shows and you like understand the policy around this. And for my thesis, I interviewed a Dookie who was the military attaché at the U.S. Mission to the UN. And he asked me how it was. I was like, yeah, it's great. I'm not sure how much it prepared me for the military. And he said, you're kind of a dumbass, Tommy. Like, everyone is going to assume you're smart from here on out, and you're going to have to like prove that they're wrong. So that's been a huge aspect of being a Dookie. And the other, I think, is just, I love the Duke is hungry. I think that there's been a hunger and a drive as being part of a Dookie of being better. And we've got lots of proud things and accomplishments in our past, but I think it's a university on the rise, and it's filled with, hungry students, hungry faculty, and great opportunity.
Hey, Eileen, what does it mean to you to be a Dookie? What do you think being a Dookie means?
Well, I'm a fake out because I'm not truly a Dookie in the sense I've never been a student here, but I'm so impressed with my students. And I also agree with what Tommy was saying about, I think Duke is actually doing really amazing programs, right? To really kind of nurture students. I feel like when I talk to undergrads who come here, Duke Engage is one of the things that brings them here. So people want to do service, that they think of this as an elite institution, which service and also a kind of sense of fellowship is really taken very seriously. As first year faculty, you're given your choice of basketball tickets. And I didn't know how we lucked out, but we ended up going to the UNC Duke game that people stand in line for tent for a month. And my husband and I were the only people wearing black, and we felt like total idiots. But I truly appreciate the spirit in the house being here.
Hardy, you are probably the only person who has served as president of student government as an undergraduate, the head of the Alumni Association, and a member of the board of trustees. So you have Duke blood throughout you, but what does it mean to you to be a Dookie?
So for me, Duke Like America is in process. So I remember being on the quad in my senior year as DSG president and railing against the lack of Black faculty on campus. And now I read that we now have one of our buildings is now called the Reuben Cook Building after Wilhelmina Reuben Cook, one of the first 5 African Americans who desegregated. So I go, we should have come a long way. Like that to me is progress and process. But Duke is about family. I think about when I was at Duke, all of the really bad decisions I made, and they were like countless. And yet I had faculty, I had peers, I had people who just kept believing in me. I mean, I remember an instance where junior year, Duke was in the finals, and I really wanted to go over to Cameron where all the students were watching the final game. And my dean said to me, "You're so behind, you really ought to stay at the dorm." And I was like, "Sure, I'll do that." And like right before the game started, I put on my Duke gear, rolled out of my dorm, and I walked out, and my dean was coming toward me. And I thought, what are you doing? She's like, "No, what are you doing? I thought I told you to stay home to do your work." And she was like, "I knew you were going to leave, so I had to come get you." So she sent me back in, and I watched the game on television, really not happy about the whole thing. But that to me is family. And then I think the last thing is Duke is about high expectations, right? That for me, all the times I wanted to take, the Michelle Obama, when they go low, we go high. I was the reverse, right? When they went high, I truly decided to go low every time. So I was always looking for the corners. And I feel like I had lots of people who pulled me aside at Duke and said, you're skating. Like you could do better. You should be doing better. We expect more of you. And that was from the dean of the chapel to my RAs, to folks at the Alumni Affairs House, people who really set the bar for me. And every time I wanted to pull the bar lower, they did not permit me to do so. So that's what Duke is for me.
Now that you have the floor, I'm going to ask some questions. The remaining 7 minutes or so we have, I'm going to ask some questions that have come in from our alums who have sent them in earlier, and I'll try to ask each of you one of them. So why don't I start with you, Hardy? You have the floor. What can the next president of the United States do to truly bring all Americans together? It said the president, I assume not the president of Duke, so I'll assume the president of the United States. So what can the next president of the United States do to truly bring all Americans together?
I would say disavow the politics of othering, of talking about Black and brown people in a way that suggests that they are separate, somehow less than, not equal to, and not entitled to the American dream as much as anybody else. So I think that's the first and foremost thing that the president could do. Okay.
Eileen, what role do immigrants and refugees play in the American story, in your view?
I think if you can't tell a story of who you are, who are you? I think that immigrants are forced to always come up with a story about themselves. And it's kind of the Fred and Ginger thing, right? Everything that Fred can do, Ginger can do in 3-inch heels and backwards. I do feel that immigrants and everybody who is not normative American in a very, very narrow sense, like you were saying about white Americans born in the US, have to do that. Learn to dance in heels and backwards. But I think that actually teaches all Americans what they need to do. The question I was asked at my naturalization exam, as I mentioned to you, was who was the third vice president of the United States? And David, a Duke education is good because you knew the answer to that, but I don't know how many people in our audience do.
Oh, you asked me, I got it right, didn't I?
Yes, you did, so.
Okay.
Good Duke education.
All right, so Tommy, let me ask you this. How do identity politics play in the way Americans think of themselves now? Because we have identity politics. Do people now view themselves as Ukrainian Americans or African Americans or Italian Americans as opposed to Americans? And is that a phenomenon that's on the rise and you think it's a problem, or you think it's not a problem?
Well, that is a tough question. So, identity politics is definitely on the rise, but the way our system is structured, where the plurality system, what you find is I think a moderation of that effect, because in order to gain political power, it's a two-party system, and you get no points for coming in a vote behind. So you see the parties kind of subsuming identity politics, and I think in Iraq, the first free and fair election that they had in 50 years, when I was there were 120 parties. Like that was pure like political identity politics. And here, the different groups, I think, come together within these parties to try to fashion a common purpose. So I think that's how that manifests in America.
Okay, Tommy, let me ask you another question. West Point is obviously different than Duke. But at Duke, do you think that the university, what's not their job to make you feel more American, but do you feel that the university does a pretty good job of instilling certain basic principles of what it is to be an American, even though that's not the purpose? Do people graduate feeling better about the country or worse about the country, in your observation?
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm sort of privileged to teach this one course, and if we go back to Tocqueville and these central ideas of equality and the opportunity to participate. I mean, two of my former students, they partnered with us at the Department of Defense. They created something called Tour of Duty, and it's a way not just for students, but really all Americans to serve their country, plug into public sector problems. Not political problems, but the actual policy of how this stuff works, and serve on that. So, I didn't ask them to do that. They sua sponte just did that on their own. And so I see this, starting with, Chris and Katie and moving all the way through, that there's this real desire for for purpose and to be active in the issues of their time.
Okay. And Hardy, let me ask you, if I could, today, what do you think Duke can do better than it does do to kind of bring people together and make them feel that they're really part of America and teach them more about what America is about, the good and the bad? What can Duke do better than it's already doing?
I think Duke is doing a pretty good job from what I can gather. I would say continuing to have honest conversations about the world that Duke students are about to go into. Right? Like that it's not to sugarcoat the realities, but acknowledge those realities and then prepare our students to deal with those realities and deal with it by empowering our students, giving them a sense of knowledge about what they can do to affect the world that they live in. I think too many times my concern is that students don't realize the power that they have. And so they think maybe because of their age or lack of experience that they squander that opportunity. I think I did. Right. And so I think Duke can continue to empower students for the world that they're about to enter into and give them a skill set to be able to adapt and be somewhat nimble, as we could see during the pandemic, right? That this is a year of like reinventing yourself almost weekly.
Let me ask you each a final question. If Hardy, I'll start with you since you have the floor. If a student came up to you and said, I'd like to read a book about a great American that could be somebody that I could use as a role model, is there somebody that you would recommend that they read a book about? It could be one or two people, or somebody that you have read a book about and you think, wow, this person is a great American.
I would probably think of Marion Wright Edelman, the former head of the Children's Defense Fund and the first African American woman to be licensed to practice law in the state of Mississippi. But I mean, she's my idol because of the challenges that she had to face in her life. And she was in a mixed race marriage, raising children at a very difficult time in a difficult place. And she always spoke truth to power and spoke it in a way that made you know that you are somebody. And so I would commend Marion Wright Edelman.
Okay. Eileen, who would you recommend that a Duke student read a book about if they wanted to read a book about a role model of a great American, somebody that you would recommend?
Two that come up sort of that students probably have heard less of. I mean, there are plenty of people know about, but Korematsu that Hardy just mentioned, but he challenged the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. Incidentally, he lost the case, but it became his life project, right? So it wasn't about winning, it was about trying. And so I feel like this kind of story about America is incredibly important, incredibly powerful, which is that immigrants and also people who seem like they don't fit into a particular American narrative at a particular point in history, they keep on trying. Another would be Wong Kim Ark, the young cook who in the late 19th century was born in the US, visited his parents in Canton, and then was stopped from coming back in because of the Chinese Exclusion Act. He took his case all the way to the Supreme Court and in fact affirmed the 13th Amendment and birthright citizenship as a way, because of his case, we have birthright citizenship affirmed as a Supreme Court case. And I feel like these are the kinds of characters that make America, America.
Okay. Tommy, who would you ask somebody to read a book about if you wanted to give them a good story of a great American?
I just reread The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt by Edmund Morris, and I think it's just a incredible profile. So many biographies, it's just they skip over all the years that the students are in, and that really documents not only like the success, the drive, but also like the challenges that he faced on that. And I think he's incredibly complicated character of someone who was Republican then led the progressive movement. So I'd recommend that book.
Okay, and that book was a great book. There's no doubt about it. So let me make a couple concluding remarks, if I could. First, let me thank you, Tommy. Let me thank you, Eileen. Let me thank you, Hardy, for a very interesting conversation. Obviously, doing Zoom conversations, you don't get the body language quite the way you do in person, but I think everybody, felt quite good about seeing what you had to say, the way you said it, and it was quite emotional for many people, and certainly for me. For all of you who are watching now, before I turn it over to someone else I will introduce in a moment, I would just like to say that Duke University has come further, I would say, in the last 50 years than any other major university in the United States. It started out as a segregated university, as many were in the South, and as we heard earlier, did not desegregate for undergraduates until 1963. And so even after that, it was still a place that had relatively few minority students and relatively few Jewish students as well. But Duke has really risen because of the desire of so many people to make this a great university, and it has become that. No university is more highly ranked in the United States with a smaller endowment. No university, I think, is as envied by so many other people and so many other schools as Duke University. And I really think that those of you who have Duke degrees should be proud of it. And as some of you have heard me say, and I'll say it again, you all have an incentive, I hope, to be involved in the alumni affairs and to contribute to Duke. And this is the reason. If Duke University is a good school, but it goes downhill, people will say, well, you went to Duke, you're not that smart, you're not that great, it's not a good school. But if Duke gets better and better and better, even though you went to Duke when it was relatively easier to get in, people will think you're smarter than you are. In my case, I went to Christoph Guttag when I was a chairman of the board and said, just humor me a bit. When I applied to Duke, what were my chances of really getting in, and what could I get in today? And he said, David, nobody on the board of trustees could get in today. When you applied in 1966, there were 5,000 applicants. We admitted about 3,000. So more than 50% of the people got in. That's how I got in. And today, of course, the Duke admission rate is, in single digits. So all of you have benefited from Duke doing very well in recent years. And I hope all of you take pride in being a Duke alumnus and a Duke parent or being connected to Duke. And I think to the extent that Duke can continue to rise as it has done, not only will we educate a lot of young people who are going to help hopefully be leaders in the country, not only will we do a lot of cutting edge research that can hopefully make the world a better place, the United States a better place, but all of us, I think, will feel better as humans for doing some things that make a great university even better. And as some of you have also heard me say, I am convinced there is a special place in heaven for those people who help Duke become better. And you might laugh at that, but why would you want to take a chance that I could be wrong? So now, thank you all for tuning in. Let me turn it over now to Sterling Wilder. Sterling has more Duke blood in her than anybody I've ever met. Her father was a faculty member for 50 years at Duke, 50 years. Sterling has been the director of the Alumni Affairs organization at Duke for 15 years. And prior to that, she worked in development for 21 years. And as we talked about earlier, she started her Duke career at 14. So she's very young, very vibrant, 36 years at Duke, and her father had 50 years. So Duke is very fortunate to have Sterling Wilder. And Sterling, let me turn it over to you now. Sterling?
David, thank you so much. I appreciate that introduction. And thanks for everyone. It was really an incredible evening. As David noted, I am Sterling Wilder. I'm a proud member of the Duke class of 1983 and the Associate Vice President of Alumni Affairs. And we are so pleased to have brought this evening's conversation to so many of our alumni and friends, over 2,000 of you. Programs like tonight's exemplify what happens when we bring together members of our incredible alumni family and Duke faculty around important and substantive topics. Thank you, David, for being our peerless moderator this evening. As always, you were just terrific and brought so much to the program. And I know that this subject is one that is near and dear to your heart. And huge kudos and thanks to our wonderful speakers, Eileen, Hardy, and Tommy. Your stories and experiences were inspiring, and they gave me, and I'm sure many of us, a lot to think about in the days and the weeks ahead. And finally, thanks to all of you who took the time to send in your questions for tonight's program and for joining us this evening. We really hope that we see you soon at another DAA virtual program. So have a great night, please vote, and of course, please be forever Duke. Thank you and take care. Have a good evening.